A very good afternoon to you. Bon après-midi. I have the honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Aylward, the Special Representative of the Director General for the Ebola Response and Assistant Director General Emergencies. But the first to take the floor will be Dr. David Nabarro, UN Secretary General's Ebola Envoy. Dr. Nabarro, the floor is yours.
First of all, I'm very pleased indeed to be here again. And I know you've just had a very long session, so we will be quite brief with our remarks and then very keen to answer questions. This is one of our regular exchanges with you on the global Ebola response. And I'm very pleased that you're able to join me and Bruce Aylward from the World Health Organization, who's flown in for today, and he will be able to provide you with latest developments in the outbreak and also on the response. We've just come from a meeting with member states on the resources that are required in order to get to 0 cases and end the outbreak. And I thought that to save time, it'd be best if quickly I invited Bruce to give you his assessment, and then I would like, after he's spoken, to briefly talk to you about some of the funds and other things that we need. Is that okay, Jean-Victor?
That's perfectly fine.
Thank you.
Dr. Aylward?
Thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bruce Aylward, as David mentioned, and I think he's given my title. I'm a couple of comments maybe to set the context for the discussions today. We are deep into, I think, what most of you know we now refer to as Phase 2 of the Ebola response. You'll remember Phase 1 was when that disease was way ahead of the response capacity, escalating like this, and our goal was to build enough infrastructure, enough beds, enough burial teams to rapidly slow down the virus. As we got then into Phase 2, which was all about trying to move from that to 0. I last week was in Guinea and Sierra Leone because it is in those two countries where we're going to have our toughest challenges in the Phase 2 as it's emerging right now. I broke the travel there to come here today to help David with the briefing on the Multi-Partner Trust Fund, because quite frankly, one of the biggest risks we face right now is that new financing for this response is falling faster than the new cases. That's the reality. The cases have started to fall like that, and the new money has fallen like this. And this right now was one of the most worrying things I was seeing in the country last week. Maybe to summarize where we are in terms of the response with a couple of numbers. As of this week, we have over 23,000 people now that have been infected. We know sick with Ebola. The actual number as of this morning is 23,366 people. 11,000 of those are in Sierra Leone, about 9,000 Liberia, 4,000 in Guinea. As important as these overall numbers and really the horrific toll this has taken so far is the trends of 2015. This year we are, maybe let me show you two pictures just to give you a sense of what keeps me up at night right now. First of all, this is the graph you see here of the overall epidemic. And what you can see here with this, we had that rapid escalation which led to the declaration of this by WHO as a public health emergency of international concern, and then the Security Council's, launch of the of UNMIR in September to escalate the international response. We focused on really three things: some rapid behavior change, burial teams, and basically treatment beds to try and stop that rapid escalation of disease. And this was a huge, probably one of the biggest successes in public health in recent years, was the blunting of that curve and then the reversal of that rate of increase, as you can see here where it fell off. Now, the first 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks of 2015, for most people in the world, incredibly encouraging because of the rapid decline in cases that we saw. We saw 4 weeks of week-on-week decline in cases. The story of the last 4 weeks has been different, and that's the reason I came to New York today and to discuss this with senior management here and with our partners. It's because of what you see here. You see 4 weeks now of a relatively flat curve, frankly, where we're seeing between about 120 and 150 cases a week. This is not what you want to see with Ebola. What we have here is an extremely dangerous hazardous pathogen present across 3 countries, big areas of 2 of those countries, and this is the danger that we're here talking about today. Because what got us, and this is what we're emphasizing as well, what caused this steep decline here was the beds and barrel teams. What will get us finished is going to be what we call case finding and contact tracing. And the big danger is that the world doesn't make that shift as the international community doesn't make that shift in its thinking and understanding as we are trying to help the countries with the response, try to adjust the strategy right now. So the second, let me show you 2 graphs. I wanted to show you that one. But everybody, the problem with this graphic here is, as much as I might point out this little part of the circle, everybody tends to see this part of the graph. It went up and it's coming down is what people see. So let me show you another graphic that we shared today. And that's this graph right here. This is a situation in 2015. And here is that flattening of the curve that I talked about. And it is here that we've got to shift our strategies. There's got to be community ownership. There's got to be case finding, contact tracing to get this thing to zero. And we've been saying for some time that the strategies that slowed this down were not what was going to get it finished. And today really is the first time now we have the data to demonstrate this. And when the world was looking at that part of the graphic right here, this part that far into 2015, the reaction, frankly, was one of relief and then inevitably complacency. This was what was happening. And what's happened now with this last 3 weeks where this flattening of the curve, frankly, the response should be one of deep concern, not alarm, because the situation is different, but certainly deep concern. The other thing that's concerning about this curve where the cases have flattened out is where those cases are. They're in Greater Conakry area and adjoining prefectures. They're in the capital of Freetown and adjoining areas, and those cases are also in Monrovia. And as we increasingly hear in the press and elsewhere, the discussion about recovery now and development of these countries, we need to be really clear. As long as the capitals of countries have got Ebola, such a hazardous pathogen, they can't recover, they can't fully develop, we can't restart the economies, we can't get that kind of progress that's needed. And as long as the virus is in those places, it can spread. It can escalate once again. You'll remember it's a very bumpy road to getting to zero on Ebola, and it doesn't have to go to zero. It can go the other direction, and unless that attention really continues to be brought to this, it will not go straight to zero. So the big goal today, and being here, meeting with partners and with the permanent missions, was to brief them on that, and with the affected countries who were with us, the ambassadors of Sierra Leone, Guinea, and the deputy perm rep of Liberia and Guinea and the deputy perm rep of Sierra Leone, was to explain that, and then that risk and concern that we're still dealing with. You know, just to wrap up, there's absolutely no question at this point that we have the strategy to get Ebola finished. There's also absolutely no question that the infrastructure is in place as a result of the tremendous success of the international and national response to the Secretary General's launch of the United Nations mission for the emergency Ebola response. There's absolutely no question. But we do not have the financing necessary to get from there, get to zero, and to do that safely and get the job finished. Also, the huge risk that people will stop looking at this crisis and looking at the needs to get it finished. So maybe in a nutshell, well, that was a very, very big nutshell, but hopefully that gives you a sense of where we are with the crisis and why we're here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aylward. Dr. Nabarro, and then we'll take some questions.
Well, thank you very much again, and for the chance to be here. As Dr. Aylward said, there has been remarkable progress. And that's only been possible really because of the ownership of local communities who've taken the steps that they needed to take to protect themselves, and then at the same time the concerted efforts by the international community in providing enormous support. The slowdown that Dr. Aylward referred to in the journey towards zero is a worry, and it shows that we have to maintain constant vigilance and surveillance to get to zero. It's what I call epidemiological detective work, and it requires many people to do case finding and contact tracing. There's a proverb that's sometimes used for this kind of work. It's like looking for needles in haystacks. That's what I said after the General Assembly 2 days ago. And so, because there's much to be done to get to zero cases, and then at the same time to begin the transition to revival of basic services and to recovery, the UN has a continued need to stay closely working with the affected countries and their communities. And we will be reallocating our resources so that they're used as effectively as possible throughout these countries. And we've got to do it quickly because the rainy season is a complicating factor, and that's why we're involved in this big surge. But to do this work, we continue to need resources. And you know that I am now very much involved in trying to raise money so we can pump up the number of people who are working in the countries, healthcare workers, international staff and national staff, so that they can complete the job of finding all the cases and help us reach zero. There's too much at stake, as the Secretary-General said, not to do this, and we must finish it as quickly and as effectively as possible. Thank you, John Bishop.
Thank you, Dr. Nabarro. Please give your name and the organization you are working for. Dr. Aylward is from Geneva, and welcome to this cold winter. First question.
Yeah, welcome this cold winter, coming from Switzerland. Thank you very much for the briefing. My name is Evelyn Leopold. I welcome you on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association. And my question is, you have mentioned getting down to zero in 60 days. Is that at all realistic? Secondly, where exactly are the extra needs? And I know you've said it before, Dr. Nabarro, but how much money do you have and how much do you need?
Okay. So thank you very much indeed. It's always, as you know, a pleasure. And we did meet when we were doing the stakeout the other day. It's lovely to see you again. So the presidents of Sierra Leone, Guinea and Liberia met in the format of the Mano River Union at a summit on the 15th of February in Conakry. And Dr. Aylward, together with our special representative, the Secretary-General Ismail Ul-Sheikh Ahmed, were there, and I'm going to invite Bruce to comment on their plan to try to get to zero in 60 days. Then I'll talk about the extra needs and why we have those extra needs, and give you the figures precisely. Bruce, please.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, at this point, finishing this is all about finding every single case and then doing the contact tracing around those cases. So, you know, theoretically, if you find every single case today, you get through one trends incubation period, there may be new cases during that, you get those rapidly isolated, you could stop the disease within 60 days. So theoretically, biologically plausible. Programmatically, extremely difficult. Right now, if you look at the challenges that these countries are facing, one of the greatest is people don't want to be a case and they don't want to be a contact. We're seeing people going to extraordinary measures not to be on a contact list or to say that they may have be a case. And part of this is because of the stigma associated with the disease now in some of these countries. So as a result, they're going to great lengths to not be a contact. If that continues, that will make the 60-day effort or target that the presidents agreed to extremely difficult. But as the president said on that day, I've certainly met all three presidents now multiple times. These people are tremendous leaders. They're tremendously pragmatic, and they understand the disease. I remember speaking to President Koroma, I think that was about a month ago, Dave, we were there together, and I said, in 30 years of hunting viruses and the rest, I don't think I'd ever sat across from a head of state who just knew so much about this and what needed to be done. So they aren't making statements like 60 days without understanding every single nuance of this disease. What they're saying is we need to see a whole different level of alarm and concern and attention brought to this. And what's driving their 60 days is their knowledge that it's going to start to pour rain, and they want as much of this stopped as possible beforehand, be dealing with as small an area as possible so that they can then get it finished during the rainy season. And again, that was part of the reason to come to New York today and to break my trip. I was in Guinea and Sierra Leone. I'm going to turn around. I'll be in Geneva tomorrow and then on a plane back to Guinea and Liberia. But it was to come here because to come in 2 months is to come too late. The issue is now when we have lead time to be able to get additional capacities in place. Now, what are the resources needed for? Well, David will speak to that because he's getting all of the requests for financing and support from the Multi-Partner Trust Fund. But in a word, therefore, all major elements of the response. When you have a gap this big, nothing is fully funded. We're cutting corners all over the place. We may be issuing contracts for 2 months or 3 months instead of for 6 months, and as a result, we get a different quality of person and we get a different continuity in the program. We are cutting back sometimes. Instead of doing contact tracing, going out and seeing a contact twice a day, we only have fuel to go out and see those people once a day. Every single corner we cut compromises our ability to find every single virus as fast as possible and to get the job done. So, at this point, we have a full program in place, but we have not got it. It's not stable enough for us to be able to, absolutely get the very best possible people and ensure that they're operating as effectively as possible. One last example, sometimes the anecdotes help. Well, I was part of the reason I flew from Guinea to Sierra Leone was we had an outbreak in a new area called Aberdeen, which is a fishing community, and the boats have been coming in and out, and they were quarantining the area, and of course boats went out very quickly. But to contact trace, all of a sudden we had to be mobile on the water. The teams had to be, which required new resources, new flexibility of our financing to be able to launch not just a couple of boats, but an effort across that huge coast, right up as far as Guinea and similarly going the other direction.
Dr. Nabarro, maybe a word on the resources before we go to the next question.
Thank you very much indeed, John Victor. So at the moment, we estimate that for 2015, the requirement for the UN system and partners to complete the work is about 1.5 billion US dollars, 1.5 billion for 2015. At the moment, we have around 600 million US dollars that has been raised for this year. The gap is about 900 million US dollars. In the absence of that money, it is, as Dr. Aylward has implied, very difficult for us to continue to put hundreds of staff in the region to make sure they have transportation, to make sure they have accommodation, and to make sure that they can continue to do the work. Obviously, if we don't get the full amount of money, we will do what we can with what we have got. But I have to tell you that at the moment we're worried because we're not able to have sufficient to maintain this level of personnel in the region without continuously feeling that we might run out of cash. And that's a very unstable situation to be in, and that's why we're making quite an intensive effort to mobilize more money, particularly for the overview of needs and resources that, if you haven't seen it, I hope you get a chance to see it, what I call the Red Book, and also for a very special mechanism that the Secretary-General set up in September last year called the Multi-Partner Trust Fund, which is the quickest and most efficient multi-partner trust fund that we've ever had in the UN, and it's also one which does very detailed reporting. This report, which is produced this morning, is available for you to peruse. Thank you, John Victor.
Thank you, Dr. Nabarro. Next question, Matthew Lee.
Sure, thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks, both of you, for coming, especially from Geneva. I'd like to ask a WHO question, which is, I've seen that they've just approved this, was described as a 15-minute test for Ebola, and I wanted to know what impact you think that will have in trying to get to zero. And Dr. Navarro, I wanted to ask, of this 900 million that you're seeking to raise, does that include the budget of UNMIR, or is the budget of UNMIR something separate out of the GA budget? And then just a WHO question, because we don't get you here very often. What has the organization learned, I guess, from, so there's been criticism about how slow it responded at first on the local level, and is there have any sort of reforms been instituted to catch these things earlier, whether in Africa or elsewhere? Thanks.
Dr. Aylward.
Thanks, sure. First on the 15-minute test, you know, WHO, we get submitted to us from many, many different manufacturers and others, various tests to really assess and say, do these meet the qualification specifications that the manufacturers claim? And basically, this is a test that, yes, does meet its specifications and standards. But it's not it may definitely help the response. It's not. I wouldn't say it's a game changer in that, you know, with Ebola, this is an incredibly unforgiving disease. As you've seen, remember, this whole thing started with one case that then went undetected for some time, even when it was, then we had the escalation. So any test that can't find every single virus reliably every single time, we have got to have backup tests for. And, you know, this is a test, I haven't got the exact specs in front of me, but it's got a high sensitivity, but it's not 100%. So, you know, it will help. It will allow us in some settings to test people coming in and say, okay, this is probably Ebola, so move it, but the person, but we still would have to do a backup test on a negative. So, you know, it may help us get to zero faster. Part of what we've learned, Matthew, the hard way is often these things perform a certain way in the lab and often on your testing, and you get it out in the field, you think it's going to change your game a certain way, it changes another. So I think that'll be easier to answer after we have a little bit more experience on the ground. But at this point, it's not like we can change an element of the program because we have this. What have we learned? I think we've learned a huge amount, everything from, you know, understanding risk identification, understanding where the risks of certain dangerous pathogens are, how we detect these, how we alert, notify, and how we respond. You know, right across the chain, we're learning. I think you're seeing within WHO it acting on those changes already. The Director General's appointment of me with the authorities of a Deputy Director General gives me command and control. I don't like that term, actually, but I certainly have the authorities across the organization, across the three levels, and also horizontally to be able to properly manage a health response like this from within the organization. I think we've learned a tremendous amount in this response, all of us, about the huge capacity that exists out there, not just in the UN system in the countries, but also in some of the more unconventional partners in terms of a response like this, like the African Union, like the Cuban brigades that were involved, and others. I think we've learned a great deal about coordination and working across the UN system. With the UNMIR in particular, it's challenged all of us in the UN to work differently through a new UN rapidly set up mechanism that I think has been quite successful. So I think we've learned a great deal. The question now is, how do you put all that together into a new organization, so to speak, in terms of emergency health response? And I think we're right in the process of looking at that. The big focus right now, Matthew, is taking lessons we learn along the way, applying them immediately, but then that big lessons learned and potential restructuring, form of the organization, that'll be a next step. But we have to get this thing finished first. So our World Health Assembly will look at that in May and then map out a timeline for the second piece of it. What is encouraging and I think exciting for everyone working in WHO is just how much the Director General has changed already over the last 3 or 4 months in particular.
Dr. Nabarro, on the gap in UNMIR funding.
Thank you very much indeed. So the UNMIR is a relatively light structure, Matthew, which is coordinating and providing support for the activities of the whole UN system working in the region. Many of the activities that will be financed through the overview of needs and requirements that we've been discussing today are embedded inside UNMIR. But the actual budget for UNMIR itself, the mission that was set up by the Secretary General in September last year, is handled separately because that becomes part of the wider UN system budget that is dealt with through other procedures.
Thank you. We have a question here. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you. Anna Guaita from Il Messaggero in Rome. I have a question for both of you. Mr. Nabarro, when you speak of complacency, do you think that Europe and United States, having gotten over their scare, feel less urgency now about the crisis in Africa? And Dr. Aylward, I know that it probably is obvious, but could you please explain better how the rainy season is going to complicate the situation? Do you mean that also it may worsen the contagion or just technically? And how soon does it start, by the way? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll start with Dr. Nabarro.
Thank you very much, John Victor. Thank you for your question. You know, it's interesting that the world is generally quite complacent about the threats from disease that can come and affect anybody anywhere. I've been working on influenzas for many years, and you know the threat to humanity that can be caused by influenza virus is a real one, and one that's with us at all times. And so I believe that this Ebola outbreak will lead to, in general, a lower level of complacency and a much greater level of alert among all governments everywhere. Perhaps that level of alert is not quite as high now as it was a few months ago, but I want to say to you that I actually believe that there's much more government and public recognition of the dangers posed by these unpleasant diseases and the agents that cause them now than there was for years beforehand. And that's why I believe that during the next few months the world will learn lessons and apply new procedures to reduce the threats that are posed by these kinds of things.
Thank you. Dr. Aylward, on the rainy season.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to make a comment also, if I might, Jean-Victor, on the complacency issue in the US and in Europe. I think we have to differentiate between the populations and the politicians. Populations, you know, they were very, very concerned. I think right now they're concerned for the populations in these countries. They're not as concerned for their own safety and security. I think feeling that they're at risk has gone down. I think the politicians still really get it, quite frankly. They understand that as long as Ebola exists in these countries, it is a threat to certainly regional, even international security, which was the reason for UNMIR in the first place. So I think they get that. But of course, they've got to respond to the concerns of their populations. And, you know, there was a wonderful epidemiologist working in Liberia, and what he would do in front of the Liberians, what they thought was fantastic, he would say, you know, right now Ebola is right up here where you can see it, but the problem is it goes down here where then you can't see it. It goes under the water, but it's still there. And the populations only worry about what's above the water. Politicians' job is to worry about both. But unless they can see it, the populations aren't responding. So right now, the concern is people are not seeing this. They're not seeing the concern. They're not seeing, you know, that part of the graph that we're talking about. They're not seeing these maps that say it's in these capital cities, which is a real concern. So that's the reason I'm here and join David in the launch of the ONR, to make sure people continue to see this and don't wake up with that rainy season going, oh my goodness, no one told us. We have. In terms of the rainy season effect, it starts in about 2 months generally. It starts, any time between March and May, quite frankly, but usually it's the April-May period. There are certain things we know and certain things we don't know about the rainy season. We know that when it pours rain and when you haven't got tarmac roads, etc., it gets very difficult to move. And we've all worked in West Africa, and we know in some of these areas, very difficult to move. People still move, and the virus still moves with them. It's very difficult to move your responders. You've seen the outfits people wear. You've seen our treatment centers. It gets very difficult to move those kinds of pieces. So what happens is the virus gets a chance to get ahead of you again. What we don't know, that was your second point there, was biologically the impact. We've seen in the past that sometimes the number of cases may go up during or after the rainy season, but we have no understanding as to whether or not there's a biologic reason that might make this more difficult, frankly. That said, remember, when you're dealing with a super hazardous pathogen and you have an uncertainty, the right thing to do is to go very aggressively to reduce that uncertainty as much as possible. You don't want to go into that, and that's why the next 2 months are so absolutely vital. And any cutbacks we make at this point, every decision we make that let's do this differently because we haven't got the full resourcing, that is the wrong thing to be doing at this point with such a dangerous pathogen.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nabarro, would you like to wrap up unless we have any other questions?
As always, we thank you for the interest that you show in this issue. As always, we rely on you to help the world appreciate that as long as there is even one case of Ebola active in the human population, that's a danger for everybody. It's a problem for West Africa, it's a problem for Africa, it's a problem for the world, and we must stay fully engaged, all of us, until the last person with Ebola in this outbreak is under treatment and is cured. So thank you again for being with us. And because Bruce usually ends these kinds of discussions with something memorable, I would invite Bruce to see whether he's got a Bruceism for us.
No, I think I'll be memorable this time by saying David had the last word.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nabarro. Thank you, Dr. Aylward, and safe journey back to Geneva. Thank you. Bon après-midi.